Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this special legal compliance session on the COVID safe compliance vaccination rules and roadmaps. My name is Nihal Samara. I'm the General Counsel and Legal Director here at the law firm Kaizen Synergy, and I'd like to welcome you all from around the country this morning. Today's session is going to focus on the various vaccination rules. We are going to unpack these and some of the penalties. We're going to look at the exemptions around this as well too, and walk you through some of the key requirements that your agency needs to be aware about. As always, we'd like to pay our respects to the elders past and present upon the lands on which we all meet. While this session is being run by webinar and recorded, we do pay our respects to the traditional owners accordingly. So just as a brief introduction, this presentation is around the legal compliance obligations as they stand. We are just providing the general legal information session. We're not going to engage in news headlines, for example, whether anti-vax protests are legal or the likes. This is specifically focusing on the current laws, what employers, specifically in the community services sector, need to be aware about, how you can respond to these, and also use case studies of what other agencies, just like yourselves, are actually doing in order to meet these compliance requirements, and also work with their staff around the vaccination rules and what this means to them as well too. So today's agenda of what we're going to cover off in the session is going to look at the roadmaps briefly and set the scene for these. We are going to look at the different state roadmaps. We're going to unpack some of these across Victoria, New South Wales, Queensland. In the past, we've also included obviously WA, South Australia, and the likes as well too. We're going to look at how these overlap with some of the national plans as well too, and what the premiers are referring to. But importantly, what we are going to look at is what are the vaccination rules? What are the areas broadly that your agency needs to think about as we move through this next part of the vaccination policy, public health responses? We're going to look at what are some of the exceptions, exemptions, and responsibilities for employers, just like yourselves, and what are the key things that your agency needs to start to look at if it hasn't done already. With that, we're also going to look at things like service agreements, staffing contracts, and mandatory vaccination policies. Importantly, as part of this process, we are going to run these legal compliance webinars over the next few weeks, and these have been extended for at least another 3 weeks. All of the resources that we are using in today's session will be made available, including the recordings that we have as well too. That said, by attending this webinar, you should get a better understanding of what the COVID rules are as they apply to your agency, improve your awareness of, in this case, the HR rules and how these work as well too, and get a timely collection of resources that you can actually start using today, as well as looking at what are some of the COVID safe systems that other agencies just like yourselves have been doing. We've been running these legal webinars since February last year, and almost these have been run weekly as well too. As I've mentioned, this webinar is being recorded all the way up to the question and answer part of the session, where we will switch off the recording. You can continue to ask us questions in the chat group as we go along. All of these materials will actually then be published on our Gemba 360 YouTube channel as well too. And obviously, if you are watching this webinar after today's live session and you want access to the resources, then certainly we will give you those. Just contact us on the numbers listed below. That said, what I will just jump into is just to say you can access our information via our website as well too, our law firm's website, and you'll find resources listed here. We do have links to our Gemba 360 YouTube channel, and you can also see all of the past webinars that we have run since February. One of the things I will jump into very briefly for you is, and you can access this via our website, is the Gemba 360 compliance dashboard. Once you will get login details to this, each agency gets a single seat to jump into to actually access the resources that we are talking about. One of the things we will show you is the specific, let me just bring these up, policy documents and template documents that we have access to. Once you click on the Gemba Docs button, for those of you that are jumping in to these webinars for the first time, you will find that you've got the rules around some of the policy and procedures documents we can load in there, and you've got an access to a range of standard policy documents, including the sample COVID safe policy that we'll be talking about now. You can simply open that and you can see that it's opening up on the screen now for you. There are a number of other policy document templates as well too, including other checklists and resources that are also listed here for you to use as well too. The other item that I will also mention that you do have access to is if we go back to the main HR module, and I will just bring this up as well too for you to view. With that, we will be referring to this because this is what a lot of other agencies are using to manage their COVID safe works and legal compliance obligations. Once you click on the HR system, you will view the HR module. And from here, you can also load in things like your staff and personnel vaccination certificates if you require to do so, which we'll come to. Also, around some of the licensing requirements and the details, you can actually load in whether people have been vaccinated, unvaccinated, partially vaccinated, and whether they're an accepted person as well too. And this will actually send you out alerts to manage and help you manage your legal compliance obligations. So we will be returning back to this dashboard for you to view as well too as the session goes on. But I will just mention that all of these resources will be loaded in directly for you to access, and you will get access to this afternoon for you to view as well too. You will find that we also have the chat bubbles on the left-hand corner of the screen. So if you do have any questions specifically around the legal compliance areas that you do need support on, you can simply fill out this. It'll actually click up a live chat and our support desk will be online to support you as you move through this system as well too. So it is something then, a resource that is available to you. Just by brief introduction as well too, the legal work that our law firm does is slightly different than just the traditional standard law firms. We actually have set up and work with agencies to set up things like their COVID testing clinics and vaccination services. We've also worked on legal agreements covering things like service coordination plans, compliance plans, clinical governance plans around COVID safety, work with them on media releases, as well as looking at mandatory vaccinations for agencies that work across aged care, religious groups as well too. With their COVID safe plan reporting and also daily assessment forms and food banks and the likes as well. So essentially, since February, we have worked across a number of key areas, specifically supporting the community services sector. So that said, a lot of the charities that we work with have given us permission to share some of their information around, and the idea is that we're going to build some capacity within your agency today around some of the mandatory vaccination rules and how these apply to yourselves and what you need to consider. So the current context around this, and then we're going to lead straight into the session, is around essentially the modelling of roadmaps. We're seeing the rollout of vaccination rules. Policies are being announced, I'm going to say almost weekly, or at the very least every few days. We're in the situation where you can see case numbers are rising. There's been changes to things like construction areas, quarantine workers. There's talk of the federal government opening up to international travel again. But essentially what we are seeing is a level of anxiety within community service agencies, and a lot of these responsibilities falling back on CEOs, HR officers, compliance officers to try and manage all of these particular rules. And a lot of agencies are asking, where do we go from here and what do we actually need to know about in this space? I will add that all of the template information and a few questions are coming through. It will be loaded into your Gemba dashboard for you to access. Your username will be your email address, and you'll get a separate password for you to access as well too. You can simply log in and use these details and information that we're putting up as well. Some of the stuff that we have spoken about, including things like which we will come to, is things like your COVID safe plans, daily assessment forms, reporting around these. A lot of these templates and forms are available on your Gemba 360 dashboard to use. So let me run this session in reverse. Essentially, where we are going is this. Our suggested recommendations, which we will revisit at the end of the session, is to look at reviewing your COVID-safe workplace mandatory vaccination rules and how they apply to you. Staff surveys, we will also cover a bit later, but essentially this is a tool that you can push out to staff to gauge to see what their vaccination status is, and if they have any queries, questions, concerns around this as well too. We are also looking at vaccination and HR registers in terms of how to achieve some of these compliance objectives as well too. Looking at your roadmaps and COVID safe plans as well too, we'll cover off, as well as some of the exceptions and exemptions that you need to be aware of from in relation to mandatory vaccination requirements as well too. Of course, there is the part of how do you actually make this whole compliance space simpler for you. There is a lot of confusion that's out there out there at the moment, and we're hoping that these resources will help you with this process as well. Leading into next week, we are going to be looking at managing staff, volunteers, and clients, and what are some of the tools and forms that you can use to support your agency, and also ensure whether you're a religious group, a church, whether you run community health services, whether you run other types of services, specifically like animal welfare services or the likes. All of these things that we're talking about here will cover and work for you as well too. And we've seen this work over the last 12 months. So let's have a look just briefly at the roadmaps, very briefly, and then I'm going to jump straight into the vaccination rules for you. Essentially, one of the big pushes that we are seeing around this, and I'll just jump in around James's question. James has just asked, are there any rules around asking for the vaccination status of clients before they access services? That's a really good question, James. We are going to be covering that off as part of the work health and safety scope as well too. We have provided advice in this space, particularly to religious groups as well too, and also community service organisations. We also know migrant resource centres are also using screening tools as well too, in terms of where they're moving across this as well too. Christelle has just asked, can an employer mandate non-vaccination? That's an interesting question, Christelle. We'll come to that as we move through, and I'll repeat your question a bit later on. So essentially, looking at the roadmaps, one of the big pushes around this is both and you'll hear the premiers in your respective states and territories refer that their plans is consistent with the national plan. So essentially, the national plan is what we have set up here. And there's parts A, B, C, and D in terms of where the Commonwealth government is actually moving to. And there are specific activities that are aligned to each of these phases. Now, where these overlap across this is around Victoria's roadmaps. When you look at Victoria or Queensland or New South Wales, I've just put these up as examples. We have started to align these across for your agency as well too, into the space of where these overlap with the national plan as well too. And while the different premiers talk of different phases or stages, and they've got these benchmarks of either 70%, 80%, essentially what we're seeing is the push and overlaps between the roadmaps of what's happening at the state level with what's happening at the Commonwealth level as well. What is causing a lot of confusion for agencies, and I'm just going to use this one as an example, is at what part do you need to do what actions and activities? And you will find that depending on where your agency is based, and I'm just going to jump into back into the Gemba dashboard, you'll find that your dashboard has relevant plans based or templates based on where your organization is located. So if, for example, and you can access this by simply clicking on the disaster module, you can go to projects, and essentially what we've got listed is the step 1, step 2, and step 3. And also you'll also see that we've got the roadmap section listed here. And if I open up the roadmaps, it'll have a series of action items that we'll come to next week as well too, in terms of where you sit. And one of these includes things like the vaccination registers and mandatory vaccination policy. Essentially, this gives you a checklist based on where your agency is located. Now, we have just been asked, what if our agency is located across multiple states? Then essentially this plan will be updated based on your organization profile that you see here as well too. So the roadmaps that we see essentially has a list of items across this. When we look at New South Wales, it's exactly the same. They essentially give you a specific, once the vaccine target has been reached, then essentially what it means. And the same thing with Queensland when we are actually looking at specific items on the listed spaces. So the mandatory vaccination requirements, let's run through these and where we're sitting. We're going to do these and take these apart state by state around these based on where agencies have joined us from today. And if there are other spaces that we need to follow, then we'll bring those up. So essentially in Victoria, on the 7th of October, the Victorian Acting Chief Health Officer made directions that redefine workers that are based in Victoria and new responsibilities around this as well too. These covered everyone from construction to community services right across to greyhound racing. Under these directives, workers must be vaccinated against COVID-19 if they work in specific spaces and sites. Now, Lena's just asked, we don't have the roadmap on our disaster module. If you don't, we'll certainly get that actioned around that and bring that up to speed for you as well too. Now, within the compliance deadlines, there are deadlines based on specific public health orders. These are made under the public health and wellbeing legislation in the respective states and territories. What these powers give the Chief Health Officer in these states is exceptional powers specifically focused on public directives to protect the community. Essentially, and we're going to cover off the next few states as well too, key dates around this under the public health order announced is that by the 22nd of October, workers must have their first jab and their second dose by the 26th of November. However, there are compliance steps that need to take place by the 15th of October. And from the 15th of October, employers must collect, record and hold vaccination information. They must hold booking information of partially vaccinated and unvaccinated workers and must ensure unvaccinated workers do not work outside their ordinary place of residence and must inform workers of their public health directives. Now, Astrid has just asked, would any organisation be checking relevant policies on charities? And if so, who would that be? With that, if so, should we be connecting with them in some way to advise of new policies in place? Astrid, look, it's a good question. One of the agencies that we know has already been visiting different workplaces is Safe Work as well too, under the Work Health and Safety directives. We also know that under public health orders, the police do have powers to actually visit some workplaces as well too. We know the Chief Health Officer under the emergency powers legislation as well too. And we covered this in previous webinars where there was the omnibus legislation in different states and territories. that were passed as well too. And as such, the Chief Health Officer can actually direct, in some cases, nominated officers under their delegation to effectively police this as well too. But I will, Astrid, come to the compliance fines that can actually be issued in relation to non-compliance of this space as well too. In New South Wales, an authorised worker refers to a person who lives in a declared local government area of concern and are authorised to leave their local government area for work purposes. Essentially, authorised workers over the age of 16 who live in a local government area of concern must not leave their local government area for work unless they have a number of key requirements as listed here. Essentially, picking this up, Karen, as well too, this does answer that question, I believe, as well too. These requirements do not apply for workers on construction sites who have special vaccination requirements, or authorised workers who are unable to have a COVID-19 vaccine can request a COVID-19 vaccination exemption for medical reasons. So essentially what we are also seeing in Queensland is that the Chief Health Officer of Queensland has issued public health directions for mandatory vaccination. This requirement does not apply to everyone. It does, however, apply to this listed group of workers. Now, what we have done, for those of you that are jumping in around this, you will find that in your GEMBA dashboard, and I'll step through each part of these compliance obligations, is essentially you've got your individual items that I've listed before, where you can actually nominate, okay, someone is, for example, vaccinated. If they have been given, let's say it's been done today, and you want to set the reminder for, let's say, next year around this, and then you can essentially update and load in copies of these documents as well too. With that, we've also covered off, as part of that, under even South Australia requirements as well too, essentially running through the compliance obligations of whether you're an accepted person or not. You can equally identify and add the drop downs. So you've got essentially the options around each of these requirements in order to specifically meet these requirements, and also set up, once you set up these dates, these will actually send you out alerts to make sure that you review these in due course, especially when it comes to someone who might be partially vaccinated. They might have their jab today, and then you're going to set it for essentially another month down the track, let's say 1st of November, when they go in as well too. So picking up Jenny's point as well too, who's just said also our board members are located across Australia. If they are on our organisation business, do we need to ensure they are vaccinated as well too? That's a good question, Jenny, as well too. Some of this will rely on what roles and responsibilities they do have as well, and I'm going to come to that as part of this process. So essentially what we then have based on this, when we look at the mandatory vaccination rules, is that these public health laws do not automatically require people to be vaccinated. There are some exemptions and subsequent extended legislation that also do need to be considered. These compliance obligations are observed in things like anti-discrimination and equal employment opportunity laws, fair work, and also occupational health and safety laws as well too. We'll find that as these laws change, and I will just cover these now shortly, is that we will also be pushing further legal updates before the end of next week, before the end of this week, leading into next week, around any changes that we are seeing. All of these legal compliance responsibilities are pushed onto employers to manage, and that's something we are seeing universally across the board. These exemption and extended legal requirements we'll unpack for you now. So essentially what we're finding is that while public health orders can be issued, there are exemptions to mandatory vaccinations that may apply in each state. Broadly, when we look at these equal employment and discrimination laws means that a person may have a protected reason and essentially cannot be discriminated against if they have a valid ground for not having the vaccine. Now, what we have seen as part of this is that clearly in most of the public health orders, they are referring to medical grounds, and in some cases, like we've done work in New South Wales with the Department of, under the Department of Education guidelines for child services and education services as well too, where they are required to use a specific form, so essentially to have a look at these as well. What we are seeing around this is, though, when you look at the human rights commissioners in each state, they are also listing religious grounds and also other protected characteristics. And over the last couple of months, these have included things like pregnancy, disability, other equal employment, or anti-discrimination reasons. They also list religious grounds as well too, and we'll cover and unpack these a bit further in today's session. But essentially what we're also seeing is legislation under fair work requirements. So for employers, the protected reasons also means that you may not be able to stand somebody down or terminate their employment unless a lawful and reasonable direction has been provided, and this has not been followed. So, for example, in Victoria, there are some exemptions that may apply which allow people to work without being vaccinated, and some of these exemptions could include if a worker cannot be vaccinated because they have a medical condition, and in this case, they are required to give their employer a proof of this medical employer proof from a medical practitioner, or there may be exceptional circumstances that are listed, for example, if there is a medical emergency. Now, we have just been asked questions around what happens with volunteers. These general rules also apply to volunteers as well too. Now, with this, there's also the occupational health and safety requirements, and this was something that was asked by, I believe, Karen and Danielle on this as well too, on the chat lines, whether there is and who essentially starts to police this. Now, what we find is that under occupational health and safety guidelines, and I'm just going to discuss this on the side to start with, before COVID, essentially, and when I say this, it extended before COVID, it's not because of before COVID. So essentially, occupational health and safety laws are there to make sure that the employer, in this case yourselves, essentially provides a safe work environment for your staff and for your clients as well. And this was also picked up right at the start by James, and I'll keep coming back to people's questions who asked, are there any rules asking for the vaccination status of clients? So under a work health and safety or occupational health and safety laws, James, essentially what we're finding, and this was previously, that you are required to provide a safe work environment for your staff or volunteers, but also ensure that the services that people deliver are also safe for your clients as well. And under Occ health and safety laws, an employee can be a person, a contractor, a non-profit organisation itself as well too. So essentially you can actually see that it's actually very, very broad in terms of these rules here. But what is important here is that the Occ health and safety laws always talk about what is reasonably practicable to do so. So what are the steps that you've actually taken in order to make your workplace safe? Now, with all of these competing and what I'll call extended and exceptional requirements, whether these be under human rights or anti-discrimination or equal employment laws, whether these be under fair work requirements, whether these be under Occ health and safety laws, all of these responsibilities essentially fall back on the employers to essentially manage as part of your compliance requirements. Now, a few people on the chat group have also asked, what about these cases that are also going before the courts? And one of these cases is Belinda Setner and Jack Setner against the state of Victoria. There's also cases before the New South Wales courts as well too, and the trial is to begin on the 25th of October. So essentially, some agencies have said, do we wait and see, or can we act now around this? So what we have said to agencies is, look, absolutely, you can start to look at acting now in terms, and you should continue to do so, because there are mandatory vaccination laws that your agency is covered by around this. Jasmine has just asked also, well, what about visitors, for example, parents visiting school grounds or parents visiting hospitals who are not allowed to go into the hospital? Can these be mandated for visitors from an health and safety perspective? We have, and I'll actually show you, Jasmine and James, what other agencies have actually done. People that have joined us previously and our other agencies as well too that use GEMBA use essentially a daily, what we call a daily attestation form. It is something that essentially screens people out around this. I will just jump into that now for you as well too, just to show you how and where we'll actually show you this. So essentially one of the tools, Jasmine and James, that people are using is this tool here, which is the daily attestation form. I'll just bring this up. And essentially what it does is very quickly get people to ask questions around this. This form is similar form is actually being rolled out at the Southern Migrant Resource Centre as well too. We're just working with them around this. And what this does is will essentially allow them to screen their clients before people actually move in to provide those services. So essentially there are these cases, but some of these things that we are going to look at is around looking at, well, what are your core legal compliance obligations around this? What we are finding is that employers are required to manage the public health orders for mandatory vaccinations, but must also comply with these particular exemptions and extensions as well too. Now, somebody did ask before as well too, just around the penalties for non-compliance and who is going to police this, for a better word, so to speak, as well too. And with that, what we are finding is that essentially there are a range of penalties. These are just an example of one that's been issued, again, under the public health directives. We are finding that potential breaches for non-compliance around this is for a person is up to 120 penalty units, which is around the $21,000 mark, and for employers can be around 600 penalty units, which is around the 100,000 mark. So there are significant penalties that are attached to these as well too. But essentially, we are being asked, what does this mean and who can police this? So we are finding that under the public health and wellbeing legislation in relevant states, essentially what we are seeing is these penalties that can be applied directly to agencies or people. Obviously, these don't apply if appropriate and valid exemptions and exceptions are made around this. What we are finding is that agencies are documenting their information down, and this is where it will become critical in terms of the documentation that you have in this compliance space. I have just been asked another question around what happens where a spouse refuses to let his partner get vaccinated. What is our position? Where we work with, and this is a really good question around this, we work with a lot of women's refuge services, domestic violence, alcohol and drug services as well too. There is orders that can be made, exceptions that can be made around this. Most of the public health and wellbeing legislation and orders already provide for a position on this. Where this occurs, it is something that you need to deal with on a one-on-one basis with that particular person. And it may well be protection orders, restraining orders we have issued around partners and the likes as well too. But that is by exception that those are coming up. So essentially, how do you manage these legal requirements that we've covered? Essentially, what we have provided to you is a sample mandatory vaccination policy. We have seen, and essentially what we have seen around this is unpacking some of the core requirements that you need to meet. And we have these templates set up within your dashboard, which you will be able to access. And with it, I'll just show you where to go around this, because we're going to jump back to the slides and walk you through exactly where you can access this information directly from. So in the GEMBA Docs section, you will find that there is a template policies and procedures section. You can open this up. It does have the template policies, and you've got your sample mandatory vaccination policy that you can open up. These are all Word documents. Simply click on the link and it will open up for you as well too. It's as simple as that. You can see that I'm just running this off and it's happening live for you to access as well. That said, with these, essentially the sample mandatory vaccination policies, when you work through these, what we have suggested that you do is look at some of the factors you should look at on an ongoing basis. Now, how do you work out if these policies apply to your agency and what you need to look at? Essentially, yes, the public health order is one part around this as well too. Pallavi has just asked, is it possible to get a copy of the sample vaccination policy? Absolutely, Pallavi. You'll be able to access that via your Gemba dashboard, and you'll get those details this afternoon to be able to log in and view. And those sample templates, there's about a dozen different templates that you can access out of it. So some of the policies, policy positions around mandatory vaccination is to look at, firstly, the Australian Health Protection Principal Committee guidelines around this. Again, those templates are there. Will your worker be exposed to the risk of infection? So some of these things that we've looked at outside even the public health order is around, well, will your workers actually be exposed to a risk of infection as part of their work? And this is something that we actually put up back in February this year. And with it, it's important that even, I'm going to say, outside public health orders, and I'll come to where the public health orders fit in, what you need to do from an occupational health and safety requirement is to say, how can I actually protect my staff and workers? We've worked across a number of different religious groups as well too. And with that, we find that, first of all, whether you run pastors or pastoral teams or the likes, congregations that come in from time to time, how do you actually protect them and what are the systems that you've got in place around that? Now, the next question is, do your workers work with people who would be vulnerable to severe disease? And what is the likelihood that that would spread? And what are the other control measures that you have in place? So those are some of the core things that you also need to look at. The other parts that you need to carefully consider is, what are your your staff contracts as well? From a legal point of view, this is where we're essentially sitting. Now, Joe has just asked, does an accounting practice with staff working on site come under professional services worker? Definition of an authorized worker, does this apply to clients coming into the office? Yes, it does, Joe, clearly around that. Professional services includes accountants, business consultants, lawyers, medical practitioners, obviously in the health field as well too. But essentially, professional services is being cast broad. You'll find, and we get asked this question a lot in this space, in the interpretation of the definitions across public health orders, we're finding that rather than trying to narrow the scope down, the government and various policy directives that are coming out of the various state health departments are increasingly making the scope broad as possible, because it is under a public health order as well. So essentially what we're seeing with some of these legal documents and staff contracts, and Joe, this can apply to professional services, not just in community service organisations, but essentially looking at having them be aware of how to report incidents that might be occurred, their exposures, or also asking for essentially covering off any specific COVID activities that they need to report. What we are finding is that staff contracts are being renewed, and we've been doing these at our law firm since, well, February this year, as the vaccine program has been ramping up, to ensure that all current and future contracts are managed appropriately. And these are some of the core requirements that we've certainly been covering off. With that said, there are rules under Fair Work that you can also ask people for their vaccination status for new workers as well too, and that's something that Fair Work has been open about as well. The other documents that we've also suggested that agencies do in terms of managing their mandatory vaccination position is to look at service agreements that you have with other agencies as well. So one of the things that certainly has been coming up is around insurance requirements. So can another agency indemnify you for ensuring that they make certain that their staff are in fact vaccinated where appropriate, and if they're not, what does that mean for you? And also what we call supply chain agreements for essential services that provide services to yourself as well too. Karen has just asked, would you consider a college with a residential students to be a high risk setting, which would require mandatory vaccination? Yes, potentially, Karen, that's correct. We've been working across also to give you an example of similar settings. Generally, we'll look at the location of where people are placed as well, where there are residential students and they are living on site, obviously dependent on the type of building as well too, but essentially students living in close quarters with each other, whether that be, I'm going to say, either boarding house type of residential students, or alternatively university colleges as well too. They can be essentially quite similar to some of the high rises that we've seen around the country and the capacity of spread of this virus throughout them. So essentially, there is the option around high risk settings for those. We've seen that also in women's refuge services, domestic violence services, and alcohol and other drug programs as well too, in similar settings. So potentially there are the high risk groups that you have coming in. What we've done on this, and I'm just going to go backwards into the mandatory policy document as well too, slide. What we've essentially given you is a number of steps here to actually assess that as well too, and how you would actually manage it. If you jump into the GEMBA dashboard, and I'll just bring this up for you as well, you will find that we do have a number of checklist tools as well too. So for example, let me bring this up here. You'll find that there are checklist tools, Karen, that can help you do this as well too, where there are COVID controls and COVID testing notifications as well too. And this gives you essentially, if I slide this across, the checklist tools of what are some of the items that you've got. And it is essentially a Word style document to essentially use. The other one that I will mention again, let me just go back, is under the COVID policy templates as well too. You do have the work health and safety policy, which covers your areas, as well as the social gatherings and restrictions policies. Within these, if I bring this up again, and this was something that we've used previously, these are Word documents and you are able to essentially use these as well too. What it gives you is the sample details around these, and essentially capacity of what you need to meet and when and how you actually need to, and some of the key things that you need to consider, and where to store some of this information as well, which will give you some of that information available to you as well. Astrid has just asked, how long is this open? This is ongoing, Astrid, as well too. We've got these open and single seats available to you. If you are opening these up to the rest of your agency, then there is subscription arrangements which we'll send across to you to essentially use. But essentially what you've got is the resources directly listed here for yourselves to use as well. So one of the areas that we do look at around this, and I will just cover these off in terms of your legal requirements, and we'll move through these slides fairly quickly for you, is around anti-vaccination and whether it's a protected attribute. Now, essentially, when we've looked at these and the exemptions around this, and we'll come to what do you do if staff don't want to come into work, and can you compel them? So let's go through these from managing your obligations. So essentially, the human rights commissioners across the different states and territories have listed that there is no protected attribute in Equal Opportunity Act that protects a person from discrimination on the basis of their vaccination or their opposition to the vaccine. So they've essentially said that a political belief or activity in this circumstance is not a protected attribute for anti-vaccination views. So while a political belief or activity is considered a protected attribute, you can't claim that your anti-vaccination views is a political belief and therefore is a protected attribute under equal opportunity laws. So essentially, that's the current position of the Human Rights Commissioner at the moment of what we're seeing. But then the questions are, what happens if an employee refuses to be vaccinated? What can you do? And this applies also to volunteers as well. You'll find that these slides that we've done, and we've got a few questions around the policy as well too, what we've done is actually take these slides and actually knit them together into a template policy for you to use as well too. And to repeat the questions that people are asking, yes, we will actually be circulating all of these documents out to you today for your use as well. So essentially, what happens if an employee refuses to be vaccinated? So essentially, the first thing that people do is often just jump to the legal options of whether you can stand them down or terminate, or how do you in fact manage it. Just to go back, it doesn't always have to be legal around these discussions, and I know this might sound odd coming from a law firm, but the first question that our law firm actually asks is, can we ask the employee or the volunteer why, to explain their reasons? And one of the things I've put up as a recommendation is a staff survey. And you'll find that we do have templates of a staff survey, and other agencies have done this, where they've actually used a COVID vaccination survey. And the COVID vaccination survey, let me show you what one looks like, is to essentially gauge whether essentially people intend to have the vaccine. Now, one of the ones that you'll find is this here on your dashboard. And the COVID-19 vaccination survey can be as simple as this. Essentially, this is one that was used in an aged care service, and they simply sent this out to all staff. Staff were able to come in, completed it, of whether they've had the vaccine. It said from September, this was for the aged care, September 21, staff providing services are required to have the COVID vaccine. This is a Commonwealth government directive. And then they just ask, have you had the vaccine? They could answer yes or no. In this case, let's take no. If no, do you intend to have the vaccine? No. And just say, what they found was that some people were actually saying things like, I'm holding out for, let's say, Moderna or something like this. So essentially what we're seeing is this information that's collected here, but very quickly they were able to actually collect information about what is actually going on in their agency. It's one of the tools that when we look at this and we go through if someone's refusing to be vaccinated, generally the first question is why and what's their reason for it. So with it, Astrid's just asked, can it be added as a requirement for existing employees? Yes, absolutely, Astrid, as part of that. Now, if the employee has a legitimate reason for not being vaccinated, then the employee should consider what is their options around this as well too. Now, stand downs are unlikely to be an available option unless there is a direction to be vaccinated. And now, as the public health orders are being broadened right across the different states, employers have potentially the position to either stand down employees, suspend the employees without pay. But what is important, as I've mentioned earlier, is to look at the legal staffing documents as part of this process as well. One of the things that if an employee refuses to be vaccinated, can you require evidence about why they have been refused? Now, under Fair Work guidelines, and these slides we have carbon copied out from Fair Work as well too. So rather than us trying to recut this, we have gathered these information from the different regulators around this. And it's a great question, Gay, who's just asked, who decides on what a legitimate reason is? Are there guidelines around this? Okay, so let's get into that as well too, Gay. So essentially, if an employee refuses to be vaccinated, can you require evidence? Let's answer this question first. So where an employer wants to direct an employee to provide evidence, the employer should make sure that the requirement to provide evidence is also lawful and reasonable. So if there is a public health order in place, then essentially what you can do is actually ask them for the you do have a legitimate reason as to why you're actually asking for this. So essentially, if it is unclear whether direction of or the employee's refusal is reasonable, then you shouldn't take disciplinary action lightly. And as Fair Work says, seek your legal advice around this. But directing an employee to provide evidence of a medical reason for refusing vaccination is likely to raise privacy issues. Now, what does that mean? Now, essentially, what we're unpacking here is even if someone provides you with a reason for not having a vaccine, what is meant by this is where does that information go to? So, do you have an HR person within your agency? Is this kept? Is this informed to the CEO or to the board or the likes? So again, there are ways in which you just need to, I'm going to say, think this through. Our policy will give you a starting point. Our template policy will give you a starting point to actually, and we'll ask you certain questions to help you unpack this as well too. Now, can an employee refuse to attend the workplace because one of the co-workers isn't vaccinated against the coronavirus? So essentially, when we were doing these slides a number of months ago, essentially at present, assuming that there is no public health order preventing attendance, it is unlikely that an employee could refuse to attend the workplace where a co-worker isn't vaccinated. Now that has changed in some circumstances. So in some areas there is a direct public health order, and picking up James's point around different services, and Brad's point as well too, around what are the different services covered under these public health orders, then essentially vaccination is mandatory in some workplaces now, and some workplaces won't be able to require their employees to be vaccinated around this. So essentially, what you're finding is that if an employee refuses to attend the workplace because a co-worker isn't vaccinated, their employer can actually direct them to do so if it is lawful and reasonable. Now, what is the next step around this? And essentially, the question that comes out of this is, can an employer take disciplinary action if an employee refuses to get vaccinated? Now, I am going to, in short, answer this yes, but you need to step this through. So an employer may be able to take disciplinary action, including termination of employment against an employee for refusing to be vaccinated if the employee's refusal is in breach of a specific law or clear and repeated lawful and reasonable direction requiring vaccination. This was taken directly from Fair Work guidelines. Now, what this means is that it will depend on other factors like whether they are covered by a contract, whether there is a workplace policy, what award they're covered, whether there's a public health order. So you can see the items essentially 1, 2, and 3 is around the employment, 4 is around workplace policy, 5 is around a public health order. Now unpacking this, 3, 4, and 5 is exactly what we spoke about earlier in today's session, and those are the documents that are in your GEMBA dashboard around these guidelines. So you can see essentially what we're giving you is some of the tools in GEMBA to allow you to take the steps that you need to, but step through this. Don't just jump and try and terminate. I don't think anybody wants to terminate employees around or volunteers, but essentially step through things. Look at the documents we have on here because it'll give you the resources that you need in terms of getting this done. Now, can I see there are a lot of questions coming through? Can we contact around legal advice? Absolutely. We're going to send out emails later this afternoon to advise you around that, and you can certainly contact us as well too. Now, picking up Gay's point around what are the guidelines around legitimate reasons and who decides this. So essentially, Gay, this is where, and it's a really good question, Gay, that you asked, because the reading on the public health orders, everyone looks at this and goes, my goodness, this just means it's mandatory for everyone, and who is included, excluded out of this. Now, the court cases that are going on around the country, there's one in New South Wales, there is another one in Victoria that is being watched as well too. Now, on this, essentially what we are seeing is that there are protected characteristics, whether that be for medical reasons, religious reasons, and other protected characteristics. For example, if people are pregnant, have a disability, or some other protected reason. Now, those are, to answer Gay's question, under things like the equal employment laws and also anti-discrimination laws as well too. And my opinion for the court cases, I think where the court cases will spin on around this will be in this space here. So are there public health orders that people have? Are there other competing and exemptions or exceptions that you need to consider? And essentially, and our legal advice has been in this space to support community service organisations, it has been looking at the public health order, but looking at the intersection between the public health orders and the exception and exemption requirements. And that is the space that we work with around with community service organisations, like everyone that's joined us today. Equally, your documents on GEMBA give you this info. Now, one of the questions that I'm going to cover off, and a lot of agencies that have joined us previously will have heard me speak about this, is around attestation registers. And this goes right back to James, to the first question that James has asked as well too, and also Jenny's question at the start around what about volunteers and contractors, and also James's questions is, are there any rules around asking for the vaccination status of clients? Now, what we found, James, in different states is that some departments of health have asked for certain areas, and this is going back to September last year, for people to complete daily attestation registers. And what this is even before essentially the vaccine rollout, they've essentially asked them to look at completing, let me just bring this up for you, these at what we call COVID daily assessment forms. And when I click on this, essentially what it does is it's providing like a statutory declaration for the person's name, the date they're doing it and the time. And it asks them for things like, have they been in close contact? Where have they been for the last 14 days? And a series of yes/no questions, which is around screening for any COVID symptoms. Now, on this, what we are seeing is for agencies, and one of the agencies that I can talk about was around the Southern Migrant Resource Centre, and Trish Matthews, who's been responsible for rolling this out there. Essentially what they've done is got all of their direct care workers to complete these forms every day before going out and seeing clients. They're now looking at, as part of this, an amended form, which we'll put up and circulate to everyone, is around the client-facing form. So people can actually use this as part of the screening tools. Rumballara Aboriginal Cooperative as well too, which is an Aboriginal agency based out in Shepparton as well too, has also used this form as well. Now, essentially the workflow that we've seen is that what that does, importantly, is gives you an assessment very quickly, instantly, of whether anyone's at risk. And essentially this means that you can very quickly screen people's risk assessment. It's not to say that you're not going to deliver services to them, but what it does mean is that you are going to ensure that the services delivered to them are appropriate. And it may mean that they need to go and get a COVID test before you deliver services. Now, Lai has just asked, my organisation hires out rooms. Do we have the right to request vaccination status around this? Yes, you can, Lai, as well too, but again, look, some of the, while you can, what we'd suggest you do, and we've done this with other agencies that hire out rooms as well too, is actually ask them to essentially provide assurance that they've done it and indemnity cover as well too. And that would come out as part of your service agreement, where you can actually amend your room hire form to adjust that as well too. So over the next week, what we are going to be looking at is this workflow for you as well too, and unpack a lot of this information for you around your COVID assessment forms. We're going to be looking at risk assessments, risk registers as well too, just to make it easier to track all of this information across this. Now, as I've said previously, We've used these agencies as case studies in the past before, and I will just open up the phone lines in a few minutes' time. We do thank Laurie Seville, the Chief Operating Officer at Rumbalara Aboriginal Cooperative, and also Judy Line, Lena Tompkinson, the Compliance Officer at Women's Housing, and also Lindy Parker, the Chief Operating Officer as well too. And with that, essentially what we're finding across it consistently is that over the last 12 months, both agencies have implemented the GEMBA dashboard around this. They have extended it to include things like your policy documents. You've got samples of the forms around this, HR registers in terms of their COVID screenings, and also risk registers, which we're going to be looking at next week as well too. You'll also find that there are sample policy documents specifically across a number of areas. Some of these have been standardized, and Women's Housing have done similar works as well too. And again, what you're finding is that a lot of the tools that are being used is almost checklist format. So you're meeting your legal compliance obligations as you continue to do so as well. We will be sending out the information to you and copies of all of these slides today, along with the templates which you have access to. If you do have any questions, by all means, jump on the chat group now. If you are listening to this webinar after this live session and you do want to reach out to us, please do so on 1300 360 360 or email us at support@gemba360.com.